All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Happy morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Very excited to have a partner on our meeting this month. One of my favorite books is Who Not How, and one of my favorite chapters in that book is Competition is for Losers, co-author instead. And Justin, he's a friendly competitor of ours. We collaborate with quite a bit. We do a lot of the same things, but one of their unique value props that they do is economic incentives. So we're going to have a conversation about that this week. They're experts. So whenever we do that in-house, we partner with them. I know you guys are in Minnesota, but you do that nationally. So wanted to welcome to our show, Justin Erickson. He's VP of Site Selection and Economic Development. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate the opportunity.
So today we're going to talk about economic incentives, but for our listeners not familiar, can you just tell us a little bit about what that is exactly and how do you get into it?
Yeah, so I'll speak in the context of real estate clients that most SIR members are going to be working with through expansion projects and whatnot. So there are a whole host of incentives from a local municipal level to a county level to various regional players, depending upon what state you're working in, then and up to then the formal state agencies. There's also some federal programs that come into play occasionally too, but these are financial incentive programs. We won't go into the history of where these came from, starting after World War II up to the 1970s into the early 1990s. But suffice to say that these are programs that municipalities are competing with one another, states are competing with one another to try to curry favor with companies to come and make their investment and create their jobs. And at the end of the day, all of the incentives are geared towards, hey, what can we do to incentivize companies to come here and then ultimately make investments and create jobs, with the end goal being, what can we do to maintain and then ultimately grow our job base and our tax base for whatever jurisdiction that we're serving through the economic development groups that deploy these incentives.
What do those incentives look like? And what type of companies qualify? Can small companies qualify, large companies? What does that all look like?
Yep. So we'll keep it simple for purposes of today. So the three general categories that I put the incentives into are, first, the tax credit program, local tax incentives, state tax incentives. We won't get into the definitions of what's a statutory tax incentive versus negotiated. Some tax incentives are offsets to corporate income tax, some are offsets to payroll tax, some are refundable. So if you don't have the tax liability, they'll cut you cash back. So for people that say, well, that doesn't apply to us, it's always worth peeling the layers of the onion back a little bit to look a little bit more deeply. But category number one are tax credits. The second is grant programs, and everybody wants free money, right? Free government money, call now. But the evolution over the last 20 years that I've been doing this is most grant programs now are going to be structured as pay for performance. So you tell us what you think you're going to do, negotiate these incentives, and then as you perform investment, jobs, et cetera, then we'll go ahead and pay out. And that can be based on investment, that can be based on jobs, or most often a combination therein. And then the third category is going to be some sort of debt instruments. Sometimes those can be forgivable debt. Again, everybody likes free money, right? But even the debt that you have to pay back can be immensely helpful in the projects that we work on, from the real estate structuring standpoint to the capital equipment spend. When you start layering in this interest environment that we're living in, coupled with lower loan to value ratios from banks, you start plugging in lower interest debt, you plug in subordinate debt instruments, and you can have a lot of impact on the capital stack structuring that oftentimes gets overlooked, which gets into the second part of your question, which is who qualifies for this. And so if you open the business section of whatever major metro market that you live in or closest to, or some sort of trade periodical, you see that Tesla just got a windfall of incentives to build a new factory, or now we see all things data centers, and people think, that's not me. That's not my client, because we're not investing $190 million and creating 1,000 jobs. The reality is these incentives are better positioned for smaller businesses. Our definition of small is anywhere from maybe $1 to $10 million size companies in terms of top line revenue, up to a couple $100 million. That is oftentimes the sweet spot for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't create ire in the eyes of John Q. taxpayer, meaning when people read that Google or Meta or fill in the blank are getting these windfall incentive programs, people scratch their heads and say, we really need to incentivize a company with $1 trillion market cap to come to our state? Okay. The second thing is most of these incentives will level off at a certain point. After a certain level of investment, jobs, et cetera, you get capped. And that can be at a fairly low level, meaning 10, $20 million investment, 50 to 100 jobs. And so the impact in terms of what these incentives can bring to bear relative to the project size is disproportionately larger for smaller projects. And so it just is so much easier to layer in some incentives for companies that aren't going to create a huge issue in the public ether. But most of these companies just overlook these things or don't even know that they exist.
That's an interesting data point. Just 1 to 10 million top line revenue. I think a lot of people think in terms of big cities, but also you have smaller municipalities, tertiary markets, submarkets. Like we're in Houston, we know Katy, Woodland, Sugarland will do economic incentives. So just because you're small doesn't mean that the local governments want to attract your business into their markets.
Percent.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to get into some stories, but let me maybe back up a second just to dumb it down a little bit and just to explain to the audience. Justin and I, we kind of operate similar businesses. We offer brokerage services. I know, Justin, you're more of a full service brokerage firm. We focus on tenant rep, but we help companies negotiate long-term office, industrial, healthcare leases. We'll do lease workouts, subleasing. We'll help companies buy their properties for the business use, sell their properties for their business use. I know both of our firms do labor analytics, data analytics. I think most of our competitors stop there and don't understand that what we're talking about right now is an added service that we can provide for our clients so they don't have to go do that on their own. I know a lot of firms will hire their agent to go negotiate the real estate deal. And if they're aware that there's economic incentives, they'll just figure it out, do it on their own. Or maybe their agent will be like, I want to get into that. Let me just go try and like wing it and make it up. And you guys have put like a concerted effort into being experts in this field and doing much better than others. And in that vein, let's talk a little bit about stories, how you've helped your clients. Could you explain a big dramatic win that you guys have gotten for a small client? Since we just talked about that $1 to $10 million top line revenue and the big firms, what have you done to help out the small guy?
Yeah, I'll just give one example in our backyard. So we'll start there, which was the company that came to us. They were in food production and they said, hey, everybody's looking around. Nobody really wants to build any more cold storage. So we want to get into that and buy, build, and lease. Buy, build, or lease. We'll work with any client to structure what they need. I'd say we're 80% more tenant rep, 20% disposition. But for me, I don't really care. I'm not a real estate expert. That's not my background. I'm more the economic development side. So we started down the site selection project. This probably 5-6 years ago. And what we found was their project, we found a location about an hour south of Minneapolis. So in a community about 20,000. And I think that's something that gets overlooked a lot too, is people just looking core MSAs for labor purposes and otherwise. We always say, let's expand that horizon a little bit, not just to chase incentive programs, but to widen the playing field and do our homework. But once we started winnowing it down and we got a good deal on land, we got tax increment financing, which 99% of brokers are going to be familiar with. But then once we started going up the food chain and using some of those sub-debt programs I talked about, we used a federal program called New Market Tax Credits. We used a state grant and pay for performance programs. And you started bundling all this together in terms of the grants, very little tax credits to be candid in this case, and the sub-debt programs. Their $30+ million project required a little less than $1 million of capital injection from the ownership group to get that done. So when I talk about capital stack impact beyond just the tax credits and the job creation grants, that's where it was meaningful for the company, because while they were doing all well and fine in the food production arena, this was really a new startup venture. It was a new company that they set up, and this was really their first foray. So I think a lot of times people think, again, it's got to be a huge project. It's got to be a well-established company. It certainly that doesn't hurt, but I think it's always worth taking a look at, because I would say 90% of what we layered into their project would most often get overlooked in my experience of having done this for 20 years.
Are there any surprising industries or projects that you found qualified, or is it really just everyone?
Yeah, so I would say typically through the economic development lens, economic development has typically not incentivized retail or hospitality projects. Now, somebody maybe listening to this will say, well, that's not true because we worked on a hotel development or what. Fine. But By and large, once you get beyond local tax increment financing, oftentimes those projects, retail and hospitality, are incentivized, but that's also changing a little bit too, as communities and states are saying, you know what, we don't need to just incentivize heavy investment and job creation as much as those things that want to compel people to move here in the first place for jobs or to retain workforce to want to stay here. So it's always worth asking that question. Same with housing. But I would say the bread and butter tends to be industrial projects, asset intensive projects, investment intensive, and job intensive. But rule of thumb I use is if you're looking at a $500,000 of investment, real estate and or CapEx, and that can be combined, and you're looking at 15 to 20 new jobs over the next 2-3 years with your project, it's worth asking the question. It might prove immaterial in terms of the incentives that would apply, but it's always worth asking the question.
And as for a regular street brokerage, based off the size of the company, we often advise 9 months to 2 years before that next real estate play. You need to start working on it. But for this economic incentives conversation, can you walk us through the life cycle? When should a company start thinking about this and taking action?
The start to finish is, I say, if you see yourself potentially expanding in the next year, and let me define expanding. My definition is that you're going to make a decision on where you're going to be, what you want to do. Now, that might not be that you have a negotiated PSA in place or you've got even a binding LOI that's moving into lease negotiation, but just saying, hey, in the next year, we want to make a decision on where we want to go next and how we want to do it, even if that's an on-site expansion or moving 5 minutes down the road. That's the time to start the incentive discussion, because other than being overlooked or people saying, nah, waste of time, it's the government, believe me, I can empathize with that approach, but it's worth looking into. But the other reason why, beyond getting overlooked, that people miss out on these incentives is what's called the but-for test. That means, but for these incentives, this project won't happen. Now, go back to the aforementioned Meta, Google, Tesla. Do you think they really need $10 million of tax credits to swing their project? Otherwise, financially, it just ain't going to work out. That's absurd. So what they're really getting down to is two things. One is, have you come to us and negotiated the incentives and talked to us about incentives before you've made decisions that could be construed as they've already made up their mind here, at which point these incentives then be perceived as a kickback, right? So if you've signed a lease, you've gone under PSA, you've ordered equipment, you've made an announcement, you started hiring, people are going to say, oh, looks like you've already arrived at a conclusion. So we have to work through that incentive process first. The second thing is people want to know that it's a competitive project. So if they're looking in the Houston market or DFW or wherever it is, they're going to say, hey, is this the only location within our state borders that you're looking at, or are you casting a wider net? Now, there's different degrees of seriousness around how hard you have to be looking at other options, but that's where starting that conversation, ideally, you're at least 6 months in advance, gives us the run room, because what I can assure you is that, hey, it's industrial real estate has been a tight market for the last few years. You got to move quick and you got to pull some levers to get a property under contract or whatnot. I can assure you the government's not going to speed up to meet your needs. They'll just say, sorry, you don't qualify. And we've seen companies bungle this but-for test and leave millions of dollars on the table.
Gotcha. Yeah, so you just called out in that one common mistake is just waiting until the deal is done or near the deal is to start working on the incentives. So that's a mistake. I did hear, though, you just mentioned, I think, to expand in place. Is that a common mistake that you think? I think a lot of people, we're moving. Now let's look into this because we're going to a different jurisdiction, different area. Is that a common mistake where you see people just expand their workforce, spend money on CapEx on the facility and just not even talk to local governments? Is that a common mistake?
It is. It goes back to, again, what's going to get the publicity, right? We do a small $5 million expansion. They're going to hire 20 jobs. That oftentimes doesn't get them. The news trucks are not out there with their satellite feeds going up in the air, right? So what people see oftentimes are these huge projects, and I call it scissors and shovels, meaning you either see the golden shovel going in the ground at the start of the project or you see the ribbon cutting with the scissors at the end, and people think, okay, so to get incentives, I got to build a new building, and it's probably got to be huge, and I've got to make some decades-long commitment here. The reality is, no, you don't. You can lease a building, you can expand on site, whether that is adding on to your facility, whether that's exercising a ROFR to expand in a multi-tenant facility you're already in. Again, what they're looking for is, what are you going to do to be expanding and making investment in our community, region, and state? And what are you doing to create more jobs? How the real estate piece plays in doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter because it can factor in, but you're not precluded from being incentive eligible just because you're leasing a building or because you're expanding at the location you're already in.
Right. And is it truly a competitive situation among different jurisdictions? Do they tend to operate the same? Is it completely across the board? Have you seen firms completely relocate to a different location or state that they weren't just because of a aggressive offer that was made? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I encourage clients not to let the tail wag the dog insofar as don't chase the almighty dollar because today's bucket of incentives, if you will, have to be weighed against the 5-year, the 10-year, the 20-year, albeit projections, but we have to look at labor rates, tax climate, regulatory environment, anticipated political change, all those types of things that we factor in site selection. So don't be wooed by the shiny object on the front end that is a big incentive package. But to a degree, these incentives are by definition incentives to want to get you to come there and consider their location, state, et cetera, over another. And so all things equal, yeah, it can absolutely tip the scales. And within the state borders itself, it's seen as distasteful for municipalities to start slinging mud at one another and say, you don't want to go there. That place is a loser. There's a diplomatic game to be played there because they all run into one another at the same conferences. It's a little bit more no holds barred when it comes to state by state competition, where it is a bit more aggressive. I would say if you're in one MSA, say your Houston market, you're probably not going to see appreciable difference in the incentives. Maybe a little bit with TIF and a couple things that they have, but it's going to be more the regulatory, the permitting, the stuff that is, hey, we have to get through these things more than they're paying us to come here. When we start doing state to state comparison, it starts to become much, much more different.
Okay. Now, final question, just looking into the future. Everyone's talking about AI. There's been a huge move towards automation for a while. We're seeing reshoring. Is there anything different that you're seeing or you're projecting over the next 5, 10 years?
The AI thing, who knows how that's going to play out? I use it every day. I'm 47, so I'm not exactly a spring chicken who's technology expert, but I'm learning, thankfully, because I have competent 20-somethings on our staff who teach me this stuff. I look at it as a tool. Right now, I'm not worried about being replaced because there's a human element to this. Same with on the brokerage side, right? We can run spreadsheets till we're blue in the face, but there is a psychological aspect to it. There's a negotiated piece and there's relationships to be built. And so to your earlier point about the company that says, or the broker that says, you know what, hey, I'll just do this myself. I'll wing it here. What I will caution anybody, and this is going to be self-serving, mind you, but give me a call. If there's not a role for me, if I can spend 20 minutes with you and just say, hey, here's the 2, 3 things I would be aware of and look into it. I don't need to be involved in all projects. I don't really care because a lot of times that will come back the next time. Somebody will say, hey, we did get it done, but we need some assistance this time or we don't want to do it again. But what I will say is today's found money. So you bring an incentive program to a client, say, hey, you might be eligible for this, and it could be $850,000. And all of a sudden that's found money. Tomorrow, that's an expectation. So now they built it into whatever model they have. And now if you don't execute and get that for them, now you've cost them 850 grand. I've lived through that psychological war too many times. But in terms of changes, I don't know how to forecast AI. I see it as a tool. I don't see it as a replacement for what I do. Maybe I'm horribly naive and I'll be out of a job in 6 months, but I'm not worried about it. Yeah. The one thing that I am seeing, and I'm no market indicator or forecaster, is that people are saying, let's go. Tariffs, AI, all that. Who knows how it's going to play out, but it's going to play out for our competitors too. Let's go. So we're actually seeing a ramp up, but we're also 1 to 2 years out on a lot of our projects from when they're actually going to take occupancy. So it's a slow rebound, but we're plugging away.
Thanks. That's all the time we have today. Justin Erickson with the Brookshire Companies in Bloomington, Minnesota. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.